Okay, this video will make it through the rest of the glands of the endocrine system, starting with the pineal gland. The pineal gland is attached to the roof of the third ventricle, beneath the posterior end of the corpus callosum. And after age 7, it shrinks and it's down 75% by the end of puberty. And in adults, it is a very tiny mass of shrunken tissue. So it has played its role and it shrinks after that. Does have to do with the setting of our circadian rhythms, which is our day and night, our 24-hour cycle. Synthesizes melatonin from serotonin during the night, and that process does fluctuate seasonally with the changes in the day length from season to season. It does regulate the timing of puberty in humans. We can have something called SAD, or seasonal affective disorder, that occurs in the winter or in northern climates. If we're not getting kind of enough light, if we only have 2 or 3 hours of exposure to light each day, they reduce the melatonin levels, and then we can see these symptoms: depression, sleepiness, irritability, and craving carbohydrates. So that is a thing. The next gland we're going to focus on is the thymus. The thymus, you probably have seen, we definitely talked about it in the lymphatic and immune system, but it is here in the endocrine system as well. It does get smaller after puberty. It is the site of the T cells maturing, which is important to the immune defense, which we talked about in the immune system chapter. Does secrete hormones that stimulate the development of other lymphatic organs. So we didn't really talk about that, but we know that the T lymphocytes are critical, and so the thymus has its own set of hormones to stimulate the other lymphatic organs. The thyroid is the largest endocrine gland. It has 2 lobes and set beneath the larynx, kind of wrapping around the trachea. It's made up of thyroid follicles. There's little sacs that compose most of the thyroid, and cells made of follicle cells that are cuboidal epithelium aligning those follicles. The main hormones of the thyroid gland, there is more than this, but T4 and T3, so thyroxine is T4, and then T3, and they are both have to do with the increase of the metabolic rate, also oxygen consumption, heat production, appetite. And then also we see C cells here that secrete calcitonin that has to deal with rising blood calcium, which you talked about in the AMP1 with the bones, So this stimulates the osteoblast activity and the bone formation. So all of those are coming from the thyroid gland. And there's an up-close picture of those little follicles. Embedded in the thyroid gland are 4 parathyroid glands. They're usually on the posterior surface, but they can be kind of sporadic as far as where they are. They can be found from as high as the hyoid bone to as low as the aortic arch, and they secrete a parathyroid hormone which increases blood calcium levels. When the blood calcium levels are increased, that promotes the synthesis of calcitrol, increases the absorption of calcium, decreases urinary excretion, and increases bone resorption. Now, your book goes a lot into adrenal glands, so you're going to notice I'm going to skip. So you have 2 adrenal glands that are part of the endocrine system. They sit up top of each kidney. The main part of the adrenal gland is broken up into the outer part, which is the adrenal cortex, and then the inner part, which is the adrenal medulla. It talks about 3 different zones. I'm actually not too picky about those zones. Let's talk about the core. The core is the medulla. It's 10 to 20% of the gland. It's kind of has a dual nature because it acts as an endocrine gland, but also as a sympathetic ganglion of the nervous system. And so it does get innervated by the ganglion fibers. And so it does reach the nervous system through that pathway. But then it also can release hormones, so directly into the bloodstream. So it's kind of both, just like the liver that we talked about earlier. Again, I'm going to jump through a little bit. The adrenal medulla has capabilities of increasing blood pressure, heart rate, and is able to decrease digestion and urine production. And that really comes from, I'm going to fast forward here, really comes from the steroid hormones that are produced here. There's quite a few. I'm going to focus on two because, again, there's so many hormones. We really have to cut it somehow. So from 25 to 2, aldosterone is one I want to talk about. Aldosterone comes from the adrenal cortex, specifically this one zone. Again, I don't need you to know the zones, but aldosterone stimulates sodium ions retention and the excretion of potassium ions. And so with that, there's kind of a ripple effect. So with the sodium ions being retained, the water is retained by osmosis, and then therefore blood volume and blood pressure are maintained. So that's an important hormone to know. And then cortisol is the other one in the adrenal glands that I want you to know, but it's coming from the adrenal cortex. So it regulates metabolism of glucose and other fuels. Cortisol stimulates fat and protein breaking down, and the release of fatty acids and glucose into the blood. It does help your body adapt to stress and repair tissues. So that is why cortisol is one of the two that I think is the most important from the adrenal cortex, from the adrenal glands, excuse me. Androgens do come up sometimes, so there are also some sex steroids that get released from the adrenal cortex. Androgens set libido through life. They have a large role in prenatal male development, so they may come up later. So the medulla and the cortex are not functionally independent. They do need each other, and so the medulla needs the cortisol stimulation is one way that they work together. Moving on to the pancreas. The pancreas is a digestive gland, but also has cell clusters of endocrine cells, and those are called pancreatic islets. So they do have endocrine functions because they are secreting hormones directly into the blood. The hormones that they are secreting, glucagon, is secreted by alpha cells. It is released in between meals where the blood glucose concentration is falling. And then insulin is the other big one. Insulin is the hormone secreted in the pancreas from beta cells. It's secreted during and after a meal when glucose levels are rising. And it helps to stimulate cells to absorb these nutrients and store them. And then when they do that, then the blood glucose levels will lower. So we are going to, at the end, have a video about disorders of the endocrine system, and diabetes is one of them. So insufficiency or inaction is the cause of diabetes here, if the insulin is not secreted. If it's not secreted, or if it doesn't act when it is secreted. I'm going to pass through that and that and that. Okay, and last on our tour of the endocrine system are the gonads, the ovaries and testes. They are endocrine and exocrine. So they are exocrine because they are producing whole cells, egg and sperm, which we'll get to in the reproductive system. But they are also endocrine because they are producing hormones, mostly steroids. So ovarian hormones include estradiol, progesterone, and inhibin. And then testicular hormones from the testes, testosterone, other androgens, estrogen, and inhibin. So take a closer look at ovary and the testes and kind of the microscopic anatomy. So they're able to produce whole cells, but also produce hormones that are going right to the blood. Just kind of looking through here, I feel like let's jump down to where it says functions of estradiol and progesterone. That helps with the development of the female reproductive system, also to regulate our menstrual cycle, sustain pregnancy, and prepare mammary glands for lactation. So those are probably the most important ones there. For the testes, We have the microscopic seminiferous tubules is technically where the sperm is produced, and the hormones that we need to be aware of are testosterone and then other steroids from the cells in between those tubules. So they stimulate development of the male reproductive system in the fetus and in adolescence and sustains the production of sperm.